Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. My name is Peter Atwood, and I'm coming to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, where it's lovely and sunny today after a very late snowfall yesterday. So first of all, big thanks to Daniel Huffman for organizing all of this. This has just been a fantastic resource and a great learning opportunity. And what I'm going to be doing is just taking a quick look at sort of how I go about shading relief maps in Blender. I've found it's been a really useful tool for me. I've used it a bit in the past for doing animation, and since sort of starting to explore map making a little bit more, I've also found it a really fun, really interesting tool to use, and a great way to get to create sort of tactile, sort of textural maps. So how I think I'm going to go about this is I've got a relief map that I've set up, sort of following along with Daniel's tutorial from his blog, and that's a great starting off point. I've put a link to it in the description of the stream. I've also put a link to a write-up that Owen Powell did, also a good starting off point, and something that I've learned a lot from. And then I'm just going to take a look at a couple of different tricks and approaches that I use to color and bring some and liven up these maps a bit. The other thing I'm going to do, I put a link to a Google Drive folder with this blend file in the description. Sometimes I find it can be helpful to just like pick something apart and see how it works. So that's available to download for anyone who would like to use that. All right, so what we're looking at here is Kyushu Island in the south of Japan, and a couple of things just with the setup I have here. So this is the rendered view, which you can see up with the little shaded sphere in the top right corner. And this gives a preview of how it'll appear when we render it out. The other view mode that I like to have set up is up here where we have viewport shading. And if we click on this, we see we get a very sort of detailed preview of how it will appear. This is using Blender's real-time Eevee renderer, which is much faster, but it doesn't give us as accurate lighting that we would get through from the rendered preview, which uses Cycles, which is a ray tracing render engine. The other issue with this preview is that, as you can see, if we pan the camera down, it's not actually deforming the terrain. We don't actually have 3D terrain. It's simulating the effect with a bump map. Whereas if we go to the actual rendered preview and look down on it, now we can see the sort of the texture and the elevation of the map. But to just get a really quick preview and sort of see our changes live as they happen, this viewport shading is great, and recently been significantly improved in the past few updates. The only thing to note of is if we go down into the viewport shading settings, we want to make sure that scene light and scene world are ticked. So that means that our lighting setup in our scene. So right here, I've got a sun lamp just above our plane. That'll be accurately reflected in our preview. Otherwise, it just uses a default sort of studio lighting setup. So what I've got, I'm going to split my workspace in half, and over here I'm going to leave my relief map up, and on the other side I'm going to switch it to our shader editor, which is where we can see all how the materials are set up. And I've got a handful of different materials, just using sort of showing different ways that I can color the terrain. I've got the materials set up, and I think I'll just go through them and kind of pick them apart, see how they work, and see how we can combine them to create different effects. So with just this very basic one, over here we've got our terrain displacement. So we're working with a DEM, a height map, that's plugged into a displacement node, which in turn is plugged into this displacement input in our material. And then over here, to give it the color and all the different properties of the material, I'm using a principled shader instead of a diffuse shader, because the principled one gives us all these other options, which looks kind of scary, but we don't really use most of them, but it gives us some fun options that I'll get into in a little bit. The only thing to sort of note is that we want to make sure that roughness is turned all the way up, so that way we'll have a completely diffuse surface. And I'll try and keep an eye on the live chat, but sorry if I miss anyone as I go through. So the first thing that we might want to do is tint our relief based on the elevation. So for that, we'll go to this first one. So here's the whole thing. Over here we've got our displacement, which is giving us the texture, which will stay pretty consistent throughout. We have our principled shader, and then we've got a couple of other sections over here. The first one is I want to mask out the ocean, so I want it to be a different color from the land. So for that, I'm going to divide this up once more, just briefly, and go to the image editor. So here I can see all the images that are part of this project. The one I want to look for here, if I can find it. So this one, so I just have a few like really simple masks with transparent backgrounds, and I can use that to drive where different effects and where different colors appear on the map. So this one is just to separate the land from the ocean. So to do that, we have it as an image texture, and over here we have a mix node, which lets us mix two images, or if there isn't an image plugged in, it just lets us use a color. So we plug the alpha channel into the factor input, which determines how it gets mixed, and color to color, and now we've separated out the land from the ocean. And then over here, which is where we're deciding how we want to visualize the elevation, we've got our DEM, and then the color of the DEM is plugged into a color ramp. And now we're just and I've got a few different color ramps set up to try different effects out. And it's going to map the pixel value of our DEM into these color ramps. So we just need to plug this into the other color slot in our mix node. And so with this one, it's just quite subtle, but it really sort of helps to highlight the elevation difference in the map. We can also try a more sort of natural looking color scheme where we've got green in the low-lying areas turning into red and white as we get higher up, or something more involved. This one, I used a color ramp from, there's a Blender GIS plugin. I haven't done too much with it. It seems really interesting, but it's got a few color ramps built in that we can get some nice effects with that. And actually, I'll just get rid of the grid lines overhead here. And one of the things I like about Blender is just sort of the immediate feedback you get. So I can add other colors in, and just immediately see how the material responds. So with this, so we have our elevation visualized. What if we want to visualize slope? So that's a little bit trickier, but not especially. So for this one, again, we have our displacement set up. And then over here, to get the slope, I've plugged my height map into a bump node. And what that's doing is it's creating sort of an extra layer of data for every point in our map. It's sort of the same thing as what's going on with our displacement, it's visualizing how light would reflect off the surface without actually deforming the terrain. And it does that by assigning a vector value, a three-dimensional vector value to each point, which has an x, y, and z value. And the z value of that vector we can use to visualize slope. So I've plugged my height map into a bump node into this separate XYZ node, and then the Z value goes into the color ramp. So now we can visualize just that Z value, which corresponds to slope. So when we plug that into the color, now we can see that areas with a higher slope have a lower value on the color ramp. I could also so the next step after that might be to combine the two, to combine both sort of elevation and slope to sort of highlight specific areas. And also sometimes it's nice to sort of switch back to the render preview to get a better idea of what it'll look like in the final render with the sort of more accurate lighting conditions. So if we wanted to combine both elevation and slope, I think there's a better way to do this than than the way I've been doing it. I haven't quite figured it out. If anyone has any ideas, I would definitely love to hear them. Once again, we've got displacement, same as before. We've got our ocean mask over here. And then we've got our height map going into the bump to create like a gradient for the slope. And then for the elevation color, I've got two color ramps. And what these represent, one is going to appear on areas with a very high slope, and one is going to appear on areas of the map with a lower slope. So sort of like this would be the underlying terrain, and this would be anything covering the surface, so like vegetation or snow in the higher areas. And using the slope value as a factor to using the slope value as a factor to mix them, that we'll be able to see one color ramp in areas with high slope and one color ramp in areas with low slope. So once I plug all those in, now you can see we got zooming in. This really sort of highlights where we have these little ravines coming off of the crater of the volcano in the center of the island. You can see the edges are a lot more highlighted because we're seeing the high slope color scheme as opposed to the low slope one. And again, we can, if I don't like how it's how they're mixed, I can adjust it through this color ramp. So if I think that if I want more of the more of the low gradient effect to come through. One other thing I should mention, with most of these color ramps, by default it gets set to ease for how it interpolates between stops. I find B-spline gets a nicer, sort of smoother gradient. Moving along, the next thing I might want to do is to get a little bit more visual variety, to blend in some other imagery. Someone asked, is there any way to render just the land area, for example? Yes, if you want it transparent for the rest of it except just for the land. I've got that in just a minute. But if I wanted to add some imagery to it, just to get a little bit more variety as opposed to just what we'd get with the procedural material. For this one, again, it's more or less the same for the displacement and the mask. And then all I'm doing is I have two images. One is a Landsat tree canopy raster, and then the other is an ortho image of the island. And then I'm just using these mix nodes to blend those into the blend those into the relief that I already have now. And then also, when we have the mix nodes, you can choose all the usual suspects are here for blending modes that you'd find in like Photoshop. So I haven't experimented with them too much, but definitely lots of potential there. So we can blend in our foliage, and then blend in just a little bit of the ortho imagery, take it up to like 0.4, so that now we get a little bit of the detail in the built-up low-lying areas. But we still get we can still really see the terrain. And then, because I find sometimes ortho imagery it's a little bit too noisy. So this way we still get that clarity, but then like a little bit of visual variety in built-up areas. And so I just have a couple more tricks that I've found. One might be if I want to sort of highlight an area of interest within a map. What I've done with this, so we're starting like start with a blank map, just with our water mask again. But our displacement's gotten a little bit more complicated over here. I've got my elevation map, and it splits, and then goes into a mix shader. One half goes straight into the mix, and then the other half goes into this math node, which is set to multiply. So this node will take the input, it'll take the pixel value of our height map, perform this operation on it, and then output the result. So I've multiplied it by 0.2, and then I'm using another mask to choose where the sort of dampened height map appears and where the full scale one appears. So again, we'll pull that into the height node of our displacement shader, and now we can see that this section sort of pops up, and it has a much more exaggerated exaggerated relief. And then over here, we're doing exactly the same thing we did before. We have our tree canopy imagery and our ortho imagery, and then we're using the same area of interest to mask out the rest of the map, so it only appears within our area of interest. And actually, one other thing I put together here, just a quick example of doing a little bit of labeling within Blender. I've got the names of the prefectures set up here, and doing it within Blender we can get some nice shadows. It doesn't really show up with the lighting setup that I have here. And how this works, someone asked about sort of having everything except the land be transparent. That's one of the reasons I like using a principled shader, because what I can do is I have this as another mask where it's just white text on a transparent background. And we take the alpha channel there, plug it into the alpha input of the principled shader, and now everything else is transparent except for our labels. And finally, one last example of this. So once again, I've got my my area of interest, and this time, that's interesting. Okay, I'm not quite sure. Oh, I know what happened. I changed that to the label, not the. Yeah. Okay. Okay, there we go. So now I've got the border mask plugged into the alpha channel of the principled shader. So now we've got a transparent backdrop. We can just see the land. We have our area of interest with the exaggerated relief, and then what I wanted to do with this one is just sort of see how we can use some of these other settings within the principled shader, and just like Blender's strength is being able to visualize different material properties. So what I have here is, again, our area of interest mask, this time plugged into 3 different mix shaders that are each going to change a property of the material. So the first one is color. So for this, everything within the area of interest will be gold, everything outside will be black. And if we plug that in, we can see, and for this one, I've added labels to the area of interest mask and the borders between the prefixtures as well. For this second one, called metalness, so we've got the metallic setting, and every material, as far as rendering is concerned, is either 0 or 1. It's either not a metal or it's a metal. And so for that, we've got one set to black, one set to white. So everything within the area of interest is a metal. Everything outside will be treated as non-metal. So we plug that into the metallic, and it doesn't look like much. And that's because we have our roughness set all the way up, so it's very diffuse. But if we use the second mix one to change the roughness based on whether or not it's inside the area of interest, so now everything outside the area of interest will still be very diffuse, but everything within the area of interest will be a little bit glossier. We plug that in, and we get this really cool sort of embossed gold leaf kind of look. I don't know how, there are not a ton of cases where this would be entirely useful, but it looks really neat, and I think it's a great example of sort of using Blender to its strengths as a way of being able to visualize different materials. And then we can go back to our render preview and get a look at sort of how the light plays off the different materials. And actually, if we move the camera around a bit too, we can see how the light's reflecting off the glossier area of interest. And so I've just got a couple of minutes left, sort of wrapping up. The last thing that I think I'll touch on very briefly, I'm going to go back to my base relief without any changes, and that's how changing the lighting of the scene can also dramatically affect the final result. Because, and that's sort of another strength of Blender, is being able to have a lot of control over lighting and over environment. So for this scene, I've got a sun lamp coming in at 315 degrees at a 45 degree elevation. And then if we go to our sun settings in the properties panel here, we can change the strength. And actually, this will look better if we go back to the rendered preview. We can change the strength, we can change how bright it is, we can change the color, which will have a dramatic effect, and then angle, which is sort of how large the light source is in the sky. If we take the angle down really low to 1 degree, we can see that the shadows suddenly get a lot more stark and a lot more defined. So depending on what you're going for, it can be you might want softer shadows or you might want sharper shadows. And then the last thing is, if we go into the world properties panel, our scene's being lit by the sun, but it's also being lit by basically the dome of the sky over the scene. it's being lit by its environment. So right now we have sort of a gray light, and if we adjust the strength of it, if we turn the strength down to 0, we can see already that the shadows are there's a lot more contrast, and that's because they aren't being illuminated by their environment. They're only being illuminated by our sun lamp. So one thing that I like to do, change the background lighting to a blue and make it a little brighter. That might be a bit too much. But now you get, if you look at like a photo from the International Space Station, you can see that the shadows have this bluish tint from this atmospheric scattering. Let's see, from the atmospheric scattering, so you get this sort of more realistic look to the relief. And as a last example, I can take my sun lamp, I can make it sort of more of an orange, and maybe, let's see, bring it a bit lower to the horizon, let's say 55 degrees, and then change the color to a really dark purple, and you get this nice sort of sunset look where the scene's being lit by this very orange sun, and you get a nice sort of purple shadows from the sky. And there's a ton of potential for illuminating scenes. You could try. I was watching John Nelson's tutorial on doing multi-directional hill shades, so I tried just for the heck of it to see what that might look like. I would definitely play with this a bit more to get something that isn't quite as loud, but it's a neat sort of proof of concept. So that pretty much brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about. Thank you all so much for tuning in, for listening. I'll make sure that the stream is available on this channel at this URL if you want to go back and watch anything. Again, I've got a link to this file, to this Blender file, in the description of the video. If someone downloads it, it should work. I haven't actually tested it yet, but it should have all of the masks and imagery bundled into it. So if you want to play around with that as well. And then I didn't really get a chance to look through the live chat as much as I wanted to, but I'll skim back through there and read through everything. So again, thank you so much. Thanks again to Daniel for putting all this together. I'm really looking forward to checking out the rest of the sessions. And if there's interest, I might do a little bit more of this, either as like do some more blog posts or live streams. But again, thank you, and have a good one.